What's up, everybody? I'm Kirk, and today we're taking a look at a game I'm a little overdue to talk about. An indie darling that has struck a chord with many a player. A power chord, you might say. A melting pot of classic game design, built with a DIY spirit and enough passion for two people. Thick with action and spectacle, thick with immersion and mystery, and most of all, thick with nostalgia. A fantasy epic if there ever was one, built on the bones of Doom. That's right, today we're talking about one of the most unique shooters out there. Today, we're talking about HEDON. But before we charge in blue in the face, if you're new here and you're digging what you're seeing, please consider liking and subscribing to help support this channel. Alrighty, let's head on in. Set in a colorful fantasy world full of curvaceous orc women and sinful demons, at its heart, HEDON is a hardcore arena shooter that harkens to classics like Doom. As a matter of fact, the game was built in the Doom engine, more specifically its widely used source port, GZDoom. However, unlike many shooters built in this seasoned tech, HEDON features non-linear level design with an emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving. HEDON is comprised of two chapters, both considered separate games, the Crystal Heart and the recently released BLOODRITE. Today, I will just be focusing on the Crystal Heart. Yeah, the behemoth that is BLOODRITE deserves its own video. But fret not, that one is just around the corner. HEDON is about as indie as it gets. The game was developed by the man known as Zan, an alias he shares with the game's protagonist. Zan developed HEDON as a labor of love and out of a bit of frustration. After growing more and more disenfranchised with AAA gaming, especially within the FPS genre, he strove to develop the game he wanted to play. A game that would emphasize old-school first-person gameplay that resonated with him the most. Old-school first-person gameplay he felt the AAA world had left behind. Committed to making his dream game, Zan had a major hurdle in his way. He was an architect by trade, and had zero experience in game design. However, you can never underestimate the power of passion, and in 2016 he got to work. After choosing GZDoom as his engine, he began to teach himself all the tools he'd need to know to build his fantasy world, all the while fleshing out its rich lore. The hard work paid off, and in 2019, Zan released HEDON as a total conversion mod for Doom 2, and it was well received. Zan never had any intention to release HEDON as a commercial product. It was always meant to be a game just for him and whoever was interested in playing. However, when the licensing for GZDoom changed and the software stopped requiring a Doom WAD to function, essentially graduating into an independent engine, Zan decided to jump at the opportunity to release HEDON as a standalone title on Steam, being among the first commercially released products to be developed in GZDoom. The game ended up catching fire within the retro shooter community, earning heaps of praise and a passionate, dedicated fan base. A major aspect that sets HEDON apart from other retro-style shooters is its focus on narrative. HEDON is a mixture of medieval fantasy, in the vein of Tolkien, with steampunk, or more specifically, crystal punk. The game revolves around the Iron Division, a society of orc and goblin women who centuries ago founded the underground city of Valk, deep within the northern mountains of their land. Harnessing the energy of mysterious crystals found within the mountain, the Iron Division was able to make great technological strides in both their infrastructure and military might, hence the crystal punk distinction. However, since the founding of their home, the Orcs have been at almost constant war with the armies of Hell, who are eager to capture the Iron Division's crystal energy. You play as Zan, a bear warrior of the Iron Division who happens to be a hybrid, half orc, half demon. A mysterious genetic makeup that hints at a much larger purpose for our big blue sister from another mister. The game begins during a botched invasion of Hell. The Iron Division forces have been decimated, and Zan is one of the last survivors. Following an explosive escape from her hellish predicament, Zan mysteriously awakens in a cave with no memory of how she got there. Making her way out of the cave system, she discovers her home has been invaded by the armies of Hell, with many of her sisters slaughtered in battle. Zan comes to learn a sinister elf warlock named Nithriel is leading the invasion with the goal of reaching the Crystal Heart, the source of the Iron Division's crystal power. With axe in hand and vengeance on the mind, Zan starts on Nithriel's path, determined to end the Warlock's reign of terror. HEDON's basic plot is archetypical for a first-person shooter. You're a lone soldier in an isolated place where demons have invaded and slaughtered everyone, and it's up to you to save the day. Sound familiar? However, HEDON takes this classic plot thread and makes it its own, expressing a surprisingly fleshed-out narrative that uses a variety of storytelling techniques. True to the game's old-school shooter roots, you have text interludes in between missions, conveying the basics of the plot and giving us insight into our badass main character. Text documents can be found littered throughout each level. They're important for progression first and foremost, often giving the player hints for their objectives. But they also give insight into the events leading up to the invasion, as well as convey HEDON's vast lore, which is quite fascinating. More on that in a sec. More creatively, the game also uses interactive story sequences, visually trippy interludes that give the player some minor platforming puzzles. It's here major plot points are conveyed with a mixture of visuals and text. I appreciate these moments of the game, mostly because it was fun to see the developer flex some eccentric level design trickery. It's an effectively told story that does a great job of driving the action of the game. There are times where it gets a little exposition heavy, and I wish the main villain was fleshed out more, but really that's just me being picky. What really elevated all of it for me though was HEDON's lore. I mentioned before the player will have to read through many documents for their objectives, which also serves to Trojan horse the lore into their heads. What I didn't expect though is how interesting I truly found the lore to be. You get a very keen insight into how the culture of the Iron Division functions, as well as their origins. Like how they originally broke away from larger orc society following a bitter clan dispute, and how their isolationist culture is divided into 6 castes, each revolving around their military, magical, and technological disciplines. The Bear Warrior caste our hero belongs to are on the front lines of the war against the demons. They hold little sway in the decision-making of the Iron Division, but have complete strategic freedom on the battlefield. Whereas the Reavers, more autonomous compared to the other castes, are the scouts and assassins of the Iron Division, primarily handling covert missions. It's really cool stuff. Seeing that Zan put so much effort into it is impressive enough, but the fact that the lore held my attention throughout the game is something else. I like reading as much as the next guy or gal, but when I'm playing something where it's a lot of fun to shoot and blow stuff up, well, let's just say reading is the last thing I want to be doing. And the fact that this game had me happily stopping down to comb through text is a feat in and of itself. As you can probably tell, HEDON's visuals are all about the retro. I can't say I'm an expert in all things GZDoom, but as far as I can tell, this is a brilliant and creative use of the tech. HEDON strives to go beyond what the Doom engine was designed to do, to not make a series of maze-like shooter courses, but actually create large, complicated worlds for the player to immerse themselves in. Of course, there's limitations. Despite GZDoom's modern-day improvements, at the end of the day, this is still tech pushing that 30-year mark. There's only so much you can do. But what I applaud the developer for is the amount of sheer effort put into the visuals to make this world feel tangible. When I learned of developer Zan's background as an architect, my only response was, of course he is. Level architecture is not only detailed and intricate, but you get a sense that there was some logic put into it beyond just blueprinting for fun gameplay, as if it was truly considered how these places would function on a normal day-to-day basis. The same kind of world building that would go into an RPG or immersive sim. Throughout the many halls and rooms of this underground orc world, you'll come across the kind of detail that gives the impression of a place that was actually lived in and worked in. Chambers with furnishings and keepsakes, sometimes messily strewn about. Laboratories with bottles cluttering shelves and ingredients hanging from the ceiling. In the barracks, scale models used to strategize attacks. Where it goes above and beyond are the, I guess you would call them, physical details in the game world. Like when you reload your weapon, the empty clip will plop down to the ground. Same with when you chug health potions. The empty glass bottle will fly through the air and onto the floor. When you kill the gothic enemy Q-tips, their knives will fly from their hands and stick into the ground. Take out a shielded Iron Maiden with an acid weapon and you'll see that the shield is being eaten away by it. Same thing if you burn them alive. The shield will be blackened and charred. It's a level of detail that is frankly unusual for a game made in this tech, and it's a lot of fun to see. Does it all look amazing? No, and we'll touch on that in a bit. But when you consider all of this was done by one man, with some help here and there, who had zero game design experience when he started this project, well, I can't help but sit back and give my Robert Redford nod of approval. Gross. Where I found rough edges in HEDON's visuals was with the artwork. Characters, enemies, and weapon sprites are all decently drawn and painted, and I think animated decently too. Enemy death animations and reload animations in particular look nice. But here and there I noticed some anatomy that just looked a little awkward. And at worst, I did find some of the character models to look messy and muddy. While their architecture always impressed, I did have some issues with the way the environments looked. There's not a ton of texture variety, especially in the outdoor areas, which causes them to look redundant real fast. And some areas look bland and flat, color-wise. Throughout your journey, you'll notice many textures that are straight up pixel art, which don't look bad in and of themselves, but I felt they clashed against the painted look of the other textures, making for a rougher composition. I want to be clear, I have a ton of utter respect for what Zan has accomplished here. This was a world I believed in, and some would say that's all that matters. But I just can't help but feel these environments could use some more passes to improve their artwork. I feel like this game could push further with its visuals. While we're on the subject of the artwork, a big thing that has made HEDON stick out are the designs of the Amazonian orc women, all depicted in a scantily clad pinup style. Ooh, mama! The main character in particular sporting a rockin' bod that on the thick scale easily goes past Snicker, and damn, I would say is a good amount past bowl of oatmeal. HEDON in general is a big old world of sexy. There's sexy orc girls, sexy elf girls, sexy minotaurs, sexy demon boys, even a few of your enemies sport BDSM themes. The dwarves got left out of the sexy though. Poor guy. I mean, we couldn't find this guy a mithril thong or something? Plus, there is the name of the game. HEDON, which is related to hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure in all its forms. I'm starting to get the impression a house party thrown by Zan would be one hell of a good time. For me, fan service stuff like this in video games is either gonna make me laugh or make me cringe. Usually cringe. But in HEDON's case, neither. Yeah, there were times I rolled my eyes at it, but it's pretty much just some pinups and hints at kink. Compared to other fantasy properties like The Witcher, HEDON is tame. For the record, love The Witcher, and that stuffed unicorn makes me laugh every time. My only criticism is that the lighthearted, horned-up visuals feel tonally mismatched to the game's story, which is quite dark and serious. But honestly, beefy orc girls with asses that don't quit is furthest from the most interesting thing about this game. I will say though, I find the design of the main character to be refreshing. Actually, I find the whole character to be refreshing. Through the years, we've seen plenty of burly, angry, badass dudes as our FPS protagonists, and I think playing as a giant blue, muscly barbarian woman who legitimately looks like she could kill you with her pinky toe is pretty sweet. One big aspect HEDON nails with flying colors is its sound design. Sound effects for weapons and everything surrounding combat just sound great. Your guns have a meaty, satisfying punch to them, and getting kills with the axe has a great squish to it. Environments are painted with thick ambiance that changes from room to room, giving levels an even greater sense of tangibility. Sound design is something indie devs sometimes leave on the back burner. Hell, sometimes AAA devs leave it on the back burner, which is why it's awesome HEDON went out of its way to create a rich soundscape. It really does add to the game's immersion. Musically, the game is strong too. HEDON is characterized by heavy metal and electronica, the sweet lullabies of first-person carnage. When in combat, you'll be treated to thrashing guitars that could easily get me moshing if played live in front of me. And when exploring, you'll get more somber, atmospheric riffs. For me though, my favorite tracks were the electronic ones, which felt incredibly nostalgic, and for good reason. Several of HEDON's tracks were composed by one Alexander Brandon, who is known for doing the original scores for Unreal, Unreal Tournament, and Deus Ex. Being a fan of HEDON himself, he was kind enough to license some of his own tracks to the game, and while they bring the Unreal games to mind, I think they fit this game like a glove. HEDON's levels are big, very big, sprawling and intricate, featuring plenty of twisting hallways and open spaces to explore, and arenas perfect for circle strafing carnage. There's also a healthy amount of platforming to complement the exploration, and plenty of small spaces to crawl through and secrets to find. As with most retro-style shooters, the collecting of elaborate keys is a big part of progression, but unlike retro-style shooters, it's not the center of it. Typically, progression hinges on solving elaborate puzzles, or rather fetching the items to solve elaborate puzzles, requiring careful exploration of the environment to find clues to their whereabouts. HEDON's levels are like giant brain teasers, with zigzagging breadcrumb trails for the player to sniff out and follow to their exciting conclusions. Yes, it does all essentially boil down to collect stuff and shoot stuff, but HEDON does a good job of always making it feel fresh. HEDON was built from a litany of influences. Obviously, the DNA of old-school shooters is spread throughout, but it's not hard to sense the influence of action RPGs and Metroidvanias in these maps. But the big influence here is immersive sims, with plenty of winks and nods to the games of Looking Glass and Arcane. In fact, the best way I could describe HEDON is that it's a boomer shooter that vibes like an immersive sim. I say vibes because it's not an ImSim in the truest sense. These levels are not governed by simulated systems for the player to creatively use for problem solving. There's certainly some room for player creativity in combat, and in that sense there's an argument for HEDON tipping into the realm of the sim. But Deus Ex and the Doom engine, this game is not. But what it does retain from immersive sims is the larger, mostly non-linear level design, affording players multiple pathways and some choice in how they want to approach situations. Take the time to explore and you'll likely find an out-of-the-way path that places you right behind a group of unsuspecting enemies. And yes, there is a stealth system in this game. It's rudimentary, and I don't think it's possible to go through this whole game undetected, but you can discover some lengthy pathways that lend themselves to sneakery, which is pretty cool. This style of level design can lead to some frustration. HEDON does not hold your hand. Eventually, you will get stuck. Often I found myself running through these levels, hitting dead ends, and not knowing what the hell to do next. As you can imagine, these were my least favorite moments of the game. Exacerbating this is the fact that the game does not feature a journal system or even an objectives tab to help you keep track of what you're supposed to be doing. That all being said, 90% of the time the solution to me being stuck was taking the time to carefully read through the clues littered throughout the level and putting my thinking cap on. Once I did, I often found the solution was is typically right in front of my nose. And despite moments of getting stuck, the game is paced very well. Even the most exploration, puzzle-intensive areas will have sprinklings of combat to break things up, and the game does wisely throw in levels with a consistent combat flow and simpler puzzles, just to mix things up. I do need to emphasize though, HEDON requires patience and attention from the player. It is not wall-to-wall action like your typical FPS. There are times in this game where it can even feel like a walking sim adventure game, and if you don't have any patience for those, then HEDON might not be your glass of scotch. HEDON certainly goes out of its way to build a convincing world, but at the end of the day, this is a first-person shooter, and in a first-person shooter, combat is king. And in HEDON, combat is excellent. HEDON does a great job stabbing at the heart of what makes old-school first-person shooting so much fun. Fast movement, sledgehammer shooting, ravenous enemies, and lots of gore. Gross. Shooting feels amazing through and through. Zan has done a great job making each weapon feel powerful and satisfying. In the beginning, you'll find the spike gun, essentially an assault rifle with a chunky fire rate. Its alt fire lets you peek down the sights and fire in 3-round bursts, feeling similar to the battle rifle from Halo. The frag fire is a powerhouse of a shotgun. Get an enemy up close and they'll be launched back in a hail of flesh and blood splatter that never got old. Its alternate fire is a flamethrower, which is very useful against a crowd. However, be careful not to have too much fun with it. You can burn through ammo rather quickly, so to speak. The potion launcher is basically a grenade launcher, featuring 2 types of potions. Pink potion lets out a cloud of poison gas that can suffocate enemies, and green potion spurts out acid, which can dissolve through defenses, like tall shields, rapidly. Easily one of my favorite weapons of the game, powerful and versatile. Plus, some of the trickery you can pull with it is pretty sweet. More on that later. Crushbow is the rocket launcher and behaves as such. Its alternate fire shoots a more focused arrow that can go through weaker enemies and cause more direct damage. The Cry Lance behaves like a rifle, deadly accurate, powerful, and good against most enemy types at any distance. It has one of the most powerful alt fires in the game, launching an energy ball that upon exploding, shoots out a hail of projectiles that can decimate enemies. And then there is the Hellclaw. This weapon is not prominently featured, only popping up in a few spots of the game. It's essentially HEDON's version of the plasma gun from Doom. It gets a lot more screen time in the sequel though, and I'll be sure to chat a little more about it in that video. Of all the weapons though, one of my favorites was one of the most straightforward, the axe. This sucker is a straight-up killer. Where most FPS melee weapons are forgettable and clunky, this thing feels like a well-oiled death dealer, well-oiled in elbow grease. Hitting enemies with this thing feels akin to cracking them with a baseball bat. It's visceral, responsive, and a ton of fun to use. And the faked motion blur in the sprite art is a nice touch. Alt-fire lets you chuck it at enemies, being one of the stronger attacks in the game if your aim is true. Even when my arsenal was fully loaded, I was never shy about whipping this guy out and batting around some baddies. While we're still on weapons, I have to take a second to highlight Bearzurker difficulty. Bearzurker is a bonus game mode featuring an exclusive arsenal of only melee weapons. That's right, no guns whatsoever. A challenge for those that have bested HEDON's campaign and want to experience it in a different way. This mode is above and beyond, a lot trickier for the simple fact that you're going up against an army of projectile enemies. Essentially, it's a mode that revolves around bringing a knife to a gunfight. I didn't go through the whole game in this mode, but what I played was a lot of fun, and I do love it when games throw in special modes like this that change up the experience. Augmenting combat is a smorgasbord of expendable inventory items the player can use. You have basics like health potions and ones that give you temporary buffs, like rapid shooting, elemental protection, and faster movement. I wouldn't say these abilities are mandatory to finish the game, but they are handy in the tougher fights, and if you keep an eye out, you might come across some secret ones that give you some massive bonuses. There are other items that are mechanically more valuable, like the turrets, which you can set up anywhere and can give you some much needed backup in some of the more chaotic areas. Fixer goggles are one of the most useful items in the game, basically night vision goggles that also highlight targets. I used these often, as there are a lot of dark areas in this game. But the real standouts are the time shards, which lets you freeze time and take out enemies in a fashion not unlike the Quicksilver sequences from the recent X-Men movies. I mean, check this out, you can throw your axe and watch it slowly go into an enemy. Ha, love it. When HEDON decides it's time for combat, it goes big. You'll be catapulted into massive enemy-infested arenas, with projectiles flying everywhere, bordering on bullet hell. One of my favorite combat portions was the boss fight against the main villain. Stripped of your weapons, you'll be thrown into a somewhat small arena with only your axe available. But as you slice off more and more of the cheeky warlock's health, more and more of the arena is added, bringing with it more of your arsenal, but also more enemies. Eventually, you'll find yourself in a demonic battlefield. It's an awesome spectacle. The enemy lineup is made up of familiar archetypes of the genre, somewhat modeled after Doom's classic roster, but designed to further test reflexes and punish lackadaisical play. Most commonly, you'll be dealing with the knife-throwing cultists, who look like freaky gothic Q-tips, hooded initiates who shoot green energy balls, not unlike Doom's imps, and the worm-like crawlers, who also shoot projectiles. However, theirs are able to freeze the player to death, and whatever enemy unlucky enough to find themselves in its path. All three of these enemies are easy to kill, especially with the axe, spike gun, and frag fire, but their rapid projectile attacks still make them a formidable danger, even in low numbers. And I have to say, I do like a game where even the weakest enemy has a shot at killing you. Beyond them, the enemies get real tricky. The Cerberus dogs zigzag through the environment, making them hard to hit, and can spit out a devastating fire attack. It's also wise to keep yourself moving around them, as they can pounce you from quite a distance if you give them a chance. Another fire type are the Forge Elementals, looking like everyone's favorite floating tomato, the Cacodemon. When a Forge Elemental is killed, they spawn little iron urchins that will kamikaze you. Flame Elementals along with the urchins can be an annoyance all around. If there was ever a time I was cheaply killed in this game, it was likely because of one of these enemies. Although if anything, it just pushed me to be more cautious around them. Iron Maidens are another fiendishly tricky enemy. Their giant shields can block most forms of attack, and can ricochet explosive crushbow arrows back at you. You can bowl them down with your standard weapons, but it's wasteful. Take the time to experiment with them. There's more avenues to killing them than you might expect. Like most aspects of the game, the enemy roster is well thought out, and while most weapons can kill most of them, there is certainly a best practice to each of them, sometimes several, which only serves to make the combat feel deeper and more technical. The one enemy that really got under my skin comes towards the end of the game: golems. These freaky females can be a pain to fight. Their mobility and agility make them tough to hit, and their attacks, a burst of black throwing stars, can seemingly come out of nowhere, on top of the fact that they can be very hard to see. I encourage you to switch on your night vision when going up against them. It makes life a lot easier. They remind me a lot of the assassin enemies from Half-Life, and they are indeed on that level of pain in the ass. Another thing I really appreciated about the combat system is that there's some room for player creativity and experimentation, which can lead to discovering some hidden combat techniques. For example, when an exploding urchin is coming at you, instead of wasting bullets on them, you can instead pull out your axe and bat them away from you. And if you happen to be lined upright, you can bat them right into enemies. Another one involves the pink potions. On top of being toxic, the pink mist also happens to be flammable. So if you shoot a bunch of it out and then light it with the flamethrower, you can enjoy yourself a nice demon barbecue. At the end of the game, you're introduced to one final mechanic: squads. That's right, you can approach one of these lovely green ladies and recruit them to fight for you. It's a very simplistic system. You can order them to defend or attack, but the AI works, and in combat these orcs are vicious, as one would expect. And their battles can be spectacular to watch. It's a shame this mechanic is introduced so late, but it is featured a lot more in the BLOODRITE sequel. The brilliance of HEDON is not that it mixes multiple genres, but that it pinpoints the emotional center of those genres and brings that into the game. First-person shooters are all about the power fantasy. The best of them make the player feel like a high-powered badass of doom. This game does that without breaking a sweat. The systemic complication and agency of immersive sims is what defines them. But often I find myself more enamored with the fun of investigating their settings, and the feeling of connection I have to them from learning all that make them tick. HEDON's setting captured me much in the same way, and the world building and focus on deeper narratives is something that has always captured RPG and adventure gamers. HEDON strives for similar heights. It's far from perfect, and it's definitely not for everybody, but coming away from HEDON, I can't help but feel it's one of the finest indie first-person shooters out there, and it would be hard for me not to recommend it among the best of them. Of course, this is not quite the end. As mentioned in the beginning, there is a meaty sequel, BLOODRITE, which I will be covering very soon, so be sure to check back to this channel for that. Otherwise, what are your thoughts on this game? Have you played it? Is it something that's right up your alley? Well, be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications on future uploads. It's a couple clicks for you and a massive help for this channel. Also, don't be shy, come say hi in the Kirk Collects Discord linked below. I'm Kirk, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.